In 2 starts to begin the 2021 season, Corbin Burnes has hurled a pair of gems. He went 6 innings, K'd 11, and gave up just 1 home run versus the Minnesota Twins. And then he went another 6 innings, K'd 9, and gave up just 1 hit versus the St. Louis Cardinals. Heading into this season, he was a pretty popular breakout pick, but there's an element in his repertoire that I'm not sure anyone saw coming. Burnes is throwing his cutter 50% of the time. It's gained 2.5 miles per hour of velocity and an unprecedented 6 inches of vertical movement compared to 2020. I think this is a pretty big reason for his early success, and it's why I'm comfortable saying Corbin Burnes is throwing a unicorn rising cutter.
A rising cutter is simply a cutter that possesses substantially more vertical movement than the average cutter. It doesn't actually rise in the same way that a rising fastball of a pitcher like Walker Buehler or James Karinchak doesn't rise. It just drops less than expected. This season, Burnes' cutter has about 6 inches more vertical movement. It's dropping 6 inches less than it did the prior season. This is substantial because according to Baseball Savant's pitch movement leaderboard, there was only one cutter last year that had this much vertical movement. It was thrown by a reliever named Cy Snead of the Astros, who is now a free agent. Snead's cutter was effective in 2020, but it didn't actually have much glove side movement. It didn't actually cut much. Burnes' cutter, compared to Snead's, moves almost 3 inches more to the glove side. It is 3 inches more cut. And that's good. It's not the plus cut that a pitcher like Walker Buehler or Zach Gallen gets on their cutter, but it's good. And the reason we're venturing into what some call unicorn territory is that Burnes' cutter is thrown at an insane 95.8 miles per hour this year. That's a 2.5 mile per hour jump from 2020. The average cutter over the last 3 years sat between 88 or 89 miles per hour, and the hardest cutters in baseball sat around 92 to 93 miles per hour. There just aren't cutters that sit above 95 miles per hour, and there aren't cutters that have this much vertical movement, and there aren't cutters that do this and actually cut. It's this combination that has made Burnes' cutter one of the most unusual pitches in baseball, and I would bet soon to be one of the most effective pitches in baseball, if it's not already. In a way, it reminds me of Kenley Jansen's cutter. Jansen's cutter, back in 2017 and 2018, when it was one of the most effective pitches in baseball, had about 3 inches more vertical movement than Burnes' cutter does presently. And it had another 3 or 4 inches of glove side movement, or that cut we're talking about. But again, Burnes is throwing his at an unconscious 95.8 miles per hour. To me, each pitch is a unicorn in its own category of unicorns. They can coexist. This sequence to Mike Trout is one I show when trying to conceptualize why a rising cutter can be so effective. Pitches with Kenley's level of vertical movement can work better up in the zone for the same reason that fastballs with high vertical movement work up in the zone well, like the Walker Buehler fastball or James Karinchak fastball we mentioned earlier. They drop less than expected and can stay above a hitter's barrel. Because Burnes is just below that level of vertical movement, he's below that level of Kenley Jansen 2017, 2018 vertical movement, he still locates the pitch down, but to left-handed hitters, it seems like he's dabbling with some elevated versions of the pitch. I suspect this is because he and the Brewers know that the pitch is creeping into a level of vertical movement that nearly mimics that of a four-seam fastball. This might also be the reason why Burnes is able to challenge hitters middle with his cutter as opposed to keeping it buried out of the zone. It's similar to how Bauer upped his fastball usage last year and subsequently had a ton of near middle challenge fastballs that beat hitters because of their vertical movement. The reason to be bullish on Burnes is because of how this cutter fits in his repertoire. I could do a whole video on his slider, a pitch that gained 3 inches of glove side movement from last year and half a tick of velocity, now sitting almost 87 miles per hour and dropping around 3 or 4 inches more than the average slider in that band of velo. Or his changeup, a pitch that's thrown 91 miles per hour but drops about 27 inches, which is in Jacob deGrom unconscious territory. But I think the most visually devastating thing for hitters is the combination of his sinker and cutter, a pair of pitches in a high tier of velocity that sustain similar vertical movement profiles, but end up about 17 inches apart horizontally on the plate. They work so well in tandem because of this rising cutter concept. To get that borderline rise on his pitch, Burnes actually needs to generate backspin on his cutter, like you would on a fastball. This backspin allows the pitch to hold its line longer and generate that appearance of late break. Last year, Burnes' repertoire felt slightly imbalanced. His cutter had more drop than his sinker, but this year they're almost perfect mirror images of each other in terms of movement profile. I base a ton of my analysis off projections, but one of the things I feel they're always behind on is adjusting to represent a new movement profile on a pitch that is being thrown by a pitcher, especially one as substantial as the change on Burnes' cutter. The sky's the limit here. It's really just a matter of workload. Burnes hasn't thrown more than 60 innings in his major league career dating back to 2018. I do think there will be some value in betting the over on his strikeouts for his next few starts, as markets, like projections, probably aren't fully in belief of what he's doing pitch-wise. And it's a big risk to go in on him in a fantasy league, but with big risk comes big reward.